Picard, come here. Let me do you a favor. I'll do you a favor. Come here. Just check this out. Computer, play me a holodeck program in the style of Dixon Hill. However, make it relaxing. I don't want anything violent.
Program complete. You may enter.
There you go, Picard. You're welcome. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Manhunt, which is episode 19 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the second season episode, Manhunt. So Manhunt is the episode where these fish people beam aboard on stasis for a conference, and Luoxana Troy is also there for a conference, and she's going through some Betazoid version of menopause that's more like being in heat, and tries hard out to force herself on Picard, and then Picard hides in the holodeck, and so then she tries to force herself on Riker and in a hologram, and then she just decides to leave to go to the conference and just blurts out inadvertently that the fish people are actually assassins there to kill everyone, which they seem very nonchalant about, and simply throw the fish people in the brig, and she beams down to the planet, and this episode, a terrible episode, mercifully ends. I often bring up the YouTube channel Lore Runner, because he does this thing where if there's an episode that he thinks is one of the worst and has absolutely no value, he'll refer to his video as a lamentation instead of usually it's a rumination, because he says he ruminates on the episode. But if it's a really bad episode that he believes represents the worst of what the show has to offer, he'll call it a lamentation. And I wish I had something similar to denote, because I think it is sort of important to differentiate between like a normal review of a normal episode and an episode that is like absolutely terrible and holds no value. Now, the only thing I've done on my channel like that is I did a list of my top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, where I would do it made it part of my normal reviews, so it's considered my review for the episode, but it's also part of the list of the worst, so it will denote in the episode review, number 7 or number 8 worst episode of the franchise. And so that's how I differentiate. But in that case, I'm only singling out the 10 worst episodes, in my humble opinion, of the franchise. And I feel like I was almost tempted to go ahead and make it 20 and come up with like a 20 worst. That way I could point out to more worst episodes, because here's the thing, this episode, Manhunt, was very, very close to making my top 10 worst. It was considered. It was, you might even call it an honorable mention. It was, in fact, I think this might have been my number 11. But because it was outside of that top 10, it didn't make that list, and so it doesn't have that special notation on it. I feel like I should, want to do something similar. Instead of calling it a review, I call it like a trashing or a pile on or something like that. But I think it's kind of too late, because I've already done a lot of bad episodes for TOS in season 1 of TNG and season 2, and so I think it's kind of, that ship has sailed to do anything unique like that. But I really wanted to note that how much I really don't like this episode. When I did my top 30 worst episodes of TNG last time I rewatched the show for my season-long reviews a couple years ago, and I did my list of worst episodes. This is my number 2, just to be clear on that. So only one episode of TNG actually made it to my top 10 worst of the franchise, which was Sub Rosa. But this was my number 2. Not Code of Honor, not Shades of Grey, although Shades of Grey was my number 3. And aren't I lucky I get to talk about that episode soon, too. I guess it's the joys of season 2. But honestly, I don't know if I might switch that order. Maybe I'll end up saying Shades of Grey is actually worse than this episode. It's all relative, though. It all depends on my mood, really, or how I'm feeling, and just which metrics I'm choosing to judge it by. It's all splitting hairs, is what I'm saying. That they're amongst the worst. Once you get to the worst of the worst of the worst, which in my opinion this episode absolutely qualifies for, then it's all just splitting hairs as to which one is slightly worse than the other. So this is up there, and as I say, as I'm going through these episodes and watching them and analyzing them and paying very close attention and listening to what other people have to say about them, I try to not come in with prejudgment. I try to really analyze, think about the episode, examine it, and make my own judgment as if I was watching it for the first time. And my feelings on this episode were absolutely reaffirmed. I didn't really look on this episode in a different way. I pretty much confirm everything that I previously thought about this episode. But that's not to say I didn't come in with an open mind. I absolutely did. But this is just not a good episode. Now, I've watched some other reviews for this episode. Most of them were negative. In my opinion, not as negative as they should have been. I think I'm probably more negative than most of them. And I think they were being a bit too fair to the episode. There's a couple things that I heard people say that I very, very strongly disagree with, which I'll get to later. But I do want to bring up the YouTube channel Reverse Angel, which I've been watching a lot of their stuff. I think there's 2 young guys who do it, and they're very sort of tongue-in-cheek and with the reviews. It's fun reviews to watch, and I've been enjoying watching their reviews. They gave this episode an A and an A minus, and everyone has their own opinions, but I'll just reiterate that these guys are young, okay, and I'll leave it at that. They seem to like the fact that the crew are acting like immature 12-year-olds in middle school. They think that's a good thing. I personally do not think that's a good thing. I think that's terrible writing. But yeah, so we disagree on that stance. So one of the things that people have been saying that I would go further than say I disagree with it. I would go as far as to say, in my opinion, it is objectively false. And that is the statement that this episode's better than Haven. I think that is objectively not true. Nah, I know sometimes it seems weird to throw out that word objective because it's all, I'm talking about subjective opinions. But when it comes to script writing and story production, like production value, acting, the quality of the construction of script according to how a story is supposed to be constructed, and how even you can do that with humor, like how jokes are supposed to be constructed. I just watched Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, and that is objectively poorly written jokes. There can be an objective standpoint. From an objective standpoint, This is a worse written episode worse episode, not just written but also written, mainly written but also performed and executed. It's just a worse episode than Haven. I am going to be as bold as that. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to like this episode better than Haven. You can. But it is an objectively worse episode. Because say what you will about Haven, and not that episode's perfect, but it has a story construction that actually makes sense about, Troy having to marry this guy. And again, maybe that could come off as cliche and dumb, and you may not like it, which is fair, totally fair. But the way it's constructed and how Luoxana fits into that storyline is actually a well-constructed, from a story structure construction, it works. Whereas this episode has no structure. It's just random shit thrown together. It's Luoxana Troy horn dogging and trying to have sex and trying to force herself into other men repeatedly, and that seems to be the threat, but there's no structure to this threat. And then Picard goes to hide in the holodeck for a bit, and then we get this Dixon Hill stuff that is just thrown in there. And then you have these fish people who are introduced at the start of the episode, and at the end of the episode, Luoxana just casually oh, they're assassins, and they go away. And there's no structure to that story. There's no sort of beginning, middle, and end the way that you would have with Haven. Regardless of how well you think that story works, it is constructed well. They introduce Counselor Troy's husband-to-be. Then they introduce his parents and introduce her parents, and then they have the little feud between them, and then they start to build a relationship between her, Troy and Wyatt that actually starts to work. Then they introduce the storyline of the Tyrellians who had this plague disease, and they slowly introduce that, and then they go into that more, and they get more into how Wyatt was the doctor, and they develop more that Wyatt was in contact with the Tyrellians. So it's all actually works. Whether you enjoy it or not is totally another question, but it is a well constructed story, whereas this story is just a jumbled mess. So yeah, I take issue with anyone who says that this episode's better than Haven. I think objectively speaking, it's not. It is objectively a worse episode. Now, on top of those objective facts of story structure, from my personal opinion standpoint, my subjective opinion, this is a way worse episode than Haven as well. Because, as I said, I was actually very interested, and I think, and this is something I brought up in Haven, is that Luoxana Troy doesn't bother me so much in that episode, where apparently she bothers some people. She doesn't bother me because she is a side character. And I think she works as a side character. She works and some of the jokes that they use with her are actually really good, like the plant going and annoying that other person, or her saying I'm in growth, or her daughter freaking out and knocking over the gong, and Data saying please continue your pet bickering. All that stuff actually works from a comedic timing wise, whereas the jokes here seem to be a variation of look how horny she is, isn't that funny? Look how uncomfortable she's making Picard by her flirting with him hard out and not taking a hint. Isn't that hilarious? And I kind of find that humor offensive, to be honest. And even if I didn't, I wouldn't find it funny or any of the other humor that they throw in at her. And also, a lot of the specific, and here's a major point, a lot of the specific jokes used in this episode were reused from Haven. They just took the same joke and did it again, but sort of less funny, less effective. I mean, not only is it less effective because they're just repeating a joke, but also they're doing it in the way that's delivered, that delivers less punch than it was in Haven. So, in other words, it's just a lesser version of Haven. So this episode is, I gotta be honest, this episode is way worse than Haven. It is not only is Haven better than this episode, Haven is far superior to this episode. God, there's so many angles I can go at this episode. But I want to, so now I'm thinking about it, I want to bring up the scene where Wesley and Riker and Data are on the bridge making fun of Roxanne and Troy. This is the scene in particular I was referencing where the crew are acting like 12-year-olds in middle school. First, I don't buy that, maybe Wesley because he's actually a teenager, but I don't buy that Riker would be behaving that way. He's sort of mocking Troy and being like, did you see the way she was doing Picard, and making light of it. And I think Picard was right to tell them off for behaving like 12-year-olds. And there's no way in hell that Data would, like, Data sitting there joking around doing his android life going, ha 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 ha. That's totally out of character for him. And so that whole scene just angers me, to be perfectly honest. Now let's get into Roxanne and Troy's storyline. So let me recontextualize this storyline for you, and say, you see where you see where I'm going with this. Let's say this episode isn't about Roxanne and Troy. It's not about Troy's mother coming on board. Let's say it's about Riker's father. And let's just pretend Riker's father is not human. He's an alien who has this alien condition that makes it so once he reaches the age of 60, his sex drive quadruples. So he comes on board and he is flirting hard out with Counselor Troy, like, will not leave her alone, and just hitting on her hard out. And it's very evident that she's uncomfortable with this flirting, but he doesn't take the hint, and he tricks her into going to dinner alone with him, and in which case he is touching her, he is advancing on her, and meanwhile, while this is happening, Riker brings this to Picard's attention, and Picard kind of laughs it off and thinks it's funny, and says, well, she gets to test her, her skills of running away. It'll be healthy for her. She'll be good. And so she, comes up with some inventive way to get Data to come in and dodge it, and runs away. And so she goes to, Riker and Picard and tell her what's going on. And their response to it is, well, we don't want to offend him, so you can't reject him outright. So maybe just hide from him. Go to the holodeck to hide. And that way we can avoid a diplomatic incident. So Counselor Troy goes in the holodeck to hide, and so Riker's dad then turns on Pulaski and is now, hard out, like, saying, you're going to marry me. You got no choice in the matter, because, I'm horny as hell. And they indulge him in this. And then Pulaski's like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to marry him now. Do you see, like, that makes a difference, right? Does that make it seem more creepy and disgusting than funny? And the thing is I don't think it makes it better the fact that it's actually a older woman who's doing this to men, and the fact that Pulaski and Troy laugh it off and like, oh well, Picard's gonna have to get out of this one. It'll be good for him. Like, yeah, just imagine two men saying that about a woman. Oh, it'll be good for Troy to have to dodge this horny man who's trying to force himself on her. Like, no. I'm sorry, but no. This is disgusting. It is not funny, and it's creepy. It's creepy. That's basically what this is. It's a creepy woman who they say, "Oh, we can't tell her. We can't turn her down because it will destroy her." Well, too bad for fucking her. She needs to live in reality. She needs to know that she can't force herself sexually on people who do not want it, who don't consent to it. I don't know, some people might think I'm being stupid about this, but I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think the fact that they're trying to make this like it's funny, that she doesn't take no for an answer and doesn't respect people's consent and their wishes, is rather disgusting. And now, granted, you could say the example I gave with the sex reversal could be, there is a different context to it, for sure, but I don't think this makes this any less creepy. You know, to me, it's maybe would be slightly worse in the reverse case, but it's still just as creepy, and it's still not okay. And I don't think it's okay to make jokes about this. So that is a major point. Now, another point to this is Troy says in this episode, Counselor Troy, Deanna, says to her mother in this episode, when she, Loxana looks to Riker and and she asks her daughter, is he still yours? And she says, humans do not own each other in that way anymore, mother. Sure, yep, no, true. There's no ownership, but there is such a thing as monogamous relationships. Those still exist in Next Generation time. And I think that's what she was actually referring to, not ownership. But she was just stating in her sloppy way. In fact, later in the episode, even though Deanna Troi and Riker are not in a monogamous relationship at this stage in their lives, when Luoxana starts hitting on Riker and saying that she's going to marry him, her response is to get very defensive, to get very possessive of Riker and very upset. And it was like, not him, mother! And it's like, but I thought you just said there's no ownership. Like, why are you getting so possessive over him? I gotta go to my happy place with this episode. It just angers me. It angers me so much, and it is just such a terrible episode. Like, nothing about it is good. Nothing. So yeah, and so then Troy is literally going around. As Loxana Troy is going around the ship examining all men and being like, this man's not good enough for me, maybe this man. And again, let's reverse the sex on this. Like, how is that acceptable? How is that not so incredibly fucking creepy? Like, I don't care if this betazoid phage condition, it's like, it's not okay. And so The other thing, and again, this speaks to the bad writing of the script. It's one of the worst written scripts in the whole show. I'm sorry, it is. That she goes to say, oh, she announces to the crew, me and Riker are getting married. Does this without, even informing him first, by the way. Just assumes that they're definitely getting married, which again is forcing herself on him. But then goes to the holodeck and sees Riker and is like, oh, you don't need to, you made your feelings on me quite clear. I know you're not really into me. So why did she get this sudden realization when she was being so obtuse to the point of announcing to the bridge crew that they're getting married, and then 10 minutes later, she suddenly realizes, oh yeah, I can see that you're really not into me. Really? Why didn't you see that before? And for that matter, when Picard was making it like 1,000% clear during the dinner that he absolutely was not interested in her, and she 1,000% would not take the hint. Now all of a sudden she's taking the hint for no reason, and then she goes and hits on this hologram. That whole thing was stupid too. How she thought Rex was a real person, and then they had to explain to her that was a hologram. Like that just wasn't funny. There was nothing like overly offensive about it. It just wasn't funny. So yeah. So Picard goes to the holodeck to do this Dixon Hill stuff to hide from her, which I think is stupid. He shouldn't have to. He's the captain of the ship. He should be able to tell her no, like any adult. And if she doesn't accept it, then too bad for her. Big fucking day. Grow the fuck up. Learn to respect people's consent. Sorry, I'm getting upset now. Anyway, so he goes to the holodeck to hide, and he plays Dixon Hill, and the computer keeps sending violent people after him when he tries to. He tells the computer like less substance, more ambience, and I think that was pretty clear. And then someone comes in and like pulls his shirt and like threatens him, and he's like, computer, this is not what I want a relaxing. So next, the computer responds to this voice command by sending a guy with a Tommy gun busting open the door saying, you're dead. Now, like, granted, that was funny, but in universe, it actually makes zero sense. Like, the computer is actually I think it needs a refit. I think the computer needs an overhaul. Either that or the holodecks suck and have no idea how to actually take commands. Now, I've heard the suggestion that Picard's not being specific enough, which is actually what I alluded to in my intro as well, that Picard wasn't being specific. Like, he could have said something very specific to make it clear what he wanted. But I think he was making it clear enough that he didn't want violence. And the computer eventually responds with, oh, we are limited to the source material for the Dixon Hill stuff. Are you, though? Like, are you really? Because it seems like you could create something in the style of Dixon Hill that would fit more with his, because he never said he wanted a specific story from Dixon Hill. So you could do something in the style of Dixon Hill that is less violent. You absolutely could. I think the computer is sucking in this episode and needs a refit. Geordi needs to get in there and fix the holodeck program because it's being really stupid. Anyway, but that, of course, was contrived writing done for humor. Which I kind of fell for because I did laugh at the scene when the guy busted open the door with the Tommy gun. But it's actually doesn't make actual sense. And in fact, they end up giving him what he wants because they get this storyline with the bartender who's being threatened, and so, but it's more low key. It's not people busting down his door and shoving guns in his face. It's more of him, having to talk it out with the bartender, which is more of what Picard wanted in the first place. So the computer actually does give him what he wants. But anyway, even though it insists, we're limited by the material of Dixon Hill, but now I'm going to give you what you want anyway. But my question is, if Picard seems to want to go in there to chill out and relax, to just sit at a desk and lean back in his chair, and why would you recreate a holodeck program of Earth 1960s Gumshoe just to sit in an uncomfortable chair at an uncomfortable desk and lean back and read a book? You could do that in your quarters. That would be much more comfortable. It seems like the only reason you would go to the holodeck is to experience. If you want to do Dixon Hill, then do Dixon Hill. It seems like you would want a mystery. Now, maybe you want a bit more low-key and not like guys shoving a gun in your face, which is what he, as I said, what he actually got eventually. But it doesn't make any sense why he would just want to lean back in an uncomfortable chair at a desk. It's like, this whole episode is written so terribly. And by the way, I feel like I'm obligated to say this, even though I don't particularly care. It's just a trivioid that everyone brings up when reviewing this episode. Matt Fleetwood plays one of the fish people in this episode. It seems weird, like he was a Star Trek fan, wanted to be in Star Trek, but it seemed weird that they put him in this fish costume where no one's going to recognize him. Like, why would they do that? Like, someone theorized that the producers of Star Trek hated Fleetwood Mac or something, which I don't think is true. I don't know. It's just like, because he's not a professional actor, and maybe they couldn't think of a role for him to be in, but at least make it so you could recognize who it is. Like, he doesn't have to have any lines. He doesn't have to do Shakespeare. Just make him recognizable. That's not too difficult. And they did that with that basketball player over in season 7. I can't remember. Was it Worthy? Someone? James Worthy or something? I don't know. Plays a Klingon in season 7. And God, his acting was terrible. But anyway. Yeah, but you don't even need to give him lines. Just make it so you can... Anyway, so I had to mention that because I feel obligated to. So let's move on from that. The fish people. This was the most pointless, like, poorly written, just thrown in there for no fucking reason storyline ever. They just pop up occasionally, and Worf talks about how handsome they are, and Wesley is a little shit who thinks they're ugly, and at the end of the episode, Picard's like, we're gonna beam down with these delegates. And Loxana's like, Loxana and Troy, by the way, the whole time saying that they look good on a platter. They think that she would look better on a seafood plate or something like that, which is very diplomatic of her. Very good ambassador she is, referring to her fellow ambassadors as seafood, and that it'd be better off being seafood. It's not so diplomatic. But anyway, so she goes to beam down with them, and she's like, I'm not beaming down with them. And Picard's like, what? They're your fellow diplomats. And they're like, those aren't diplomats, those are assassins. Hey, Luoxana, can I ask you a question? When were you going to mention this, huh? Were you not going to mention this? If Picard hadn't asked you to beam down with them, would you have bothered bringing this up? I mean, mind you, what she tells them is they're playing on they're costumes or their what they're wearing is laced in explosives, and they plan on blowing themselves up and blowing up the conference, like exploding the conference, which presumably would kill a lot of people, including herself. And she just casually mentions this like she's asking what's for dinner. Did you not find this important information to divulge earlier? Like, is this not something you think that the crew should have known? I mean, do you not care about your life at all? I mean, or the lives of others, for that matter? And then she acts like she's a hero for exposing them. But she just casually tosses it out there. Oh, yeah, these are assassins. Why not mention this? Why did you mention this before? And what? It is one of the worst written scenes in the entire show, if I'm being completely frank. I can't think of, there's hardly any scenes, not even Sub Rosa maybe, that is written worse than that scene. That is just terrible writing, and I think it's done to try to be humorous, but it makes absolutely no sense. It makes so zero sense why she would do that. And by the way, throughout this episode, Luoxana is talking like, I mean, it's obvious to anyone without empathic powers that Picard is really not into her. Yet she has empathic powers, and she can't even tell that he's not into her. And Deanna has a line in the episode that normally she's a great telepath, because Picard even brings this up. It's like, your mother's telepathic skills have to be a lot to be desired, because I am making it like super obvious that I don't want to be with her, and she's not taking the hint. And Deanna had a line where she said, normally her empathic powers are great, but the phage or whatever it is that she's going through is blocking it and interfering with her empathic powers, which is just a plot contrivance excuse to have this BS plot of her, trying to force herself on other men. So if her empathic powers aren't working very well because of this phase, then how was she able to detect these assassins so easily? I guess it's because the plot requires her empathic powers to work there, but not there, so that she can be oblivious to something you don't even need empathic powers for. But at the same time, she can detect something you absolutely need great empathic powers to figure out, or telepathic powers. It's whatever the plot requires, because this whole fucking episode is just a giant mess. I'm almost shaking how angry this episode makes me. It is so. A lot of people who talk about this episode also talk about Tracy Torme, who was a writer in seasons 1 and 2, who I never really talked about very much, just because he was only in seasons 1 and 2, and those are the bad seasons. So I don't really pay much attention to the writers who are in the bad seasons. But he did episodes like Conspiracy and Big Goodbye, and he apparently was kind of got in a feud or had like a civil war type situation with Maurice Hurley, who at this stage took over the show. And apparently Maurice Hurley heavily rewrote this episode to the point where he didn't like it anymore. So he actually took his name off of the episode and used a pseudonym instead, which is what writers do when they don't like what was done with their episode. Like DC Fontana did this several times in the original series, particularly with episodes like The Way to Eden. Those terrible episodes. And so I think that makes absolute sense to me. I wouldn't want my name anywhere near this terrible script. And it also shows how bad Maurice Hurley was as a showrunner. That this is what he did with the script, and he thought this was okay. He thought this was usable, and he thought this was a good thing to have. Now, part of it, apparently, from what I heard, was also the boss's wife, because Nigel Barrett, Gene Roddenberry's wife, kind of had carte blanche in this episode, and she also changed the script. The script apparently had more to do with Dixon Hill originally and less to do with Roxanne and Troy, but they changed it to focus more on her. And they didn't do a particularly good job. They just reused the jokes from Haven, but much worse. Like, they redid the thing about ending the episode with Roxanne beaming away. It's like, oh, Jean-Luc, how things such dirty thoughts. She said that earlier in the episode, and that was also the same ending joke they did for Haven. And that episode was actually kind of funny. And this episode is just pathetic and cringy. Anyway, I think I'm done talking about this episode. It's really made my blood boil. I do think this will remain in my top 5 worst episodes of Next Gen. I think this maybe it could have made my top 10 worse. Really, it would have been that close to making my top 10 worst of the entire franchise. I think maybe this could have beat out The Way to Eden, which was my number 10. I think maybe this is worse than that episode, to be honest. So maybe this should have been that special banner of in the top 10 worst. This is just a really particularly specially bad episode. So anyway, I want to give a shout out to all those that support me on Patreon. I very much appreciate it. It does help me continue with the channel, and I'm very humbled and thankful for all of those who support me on Patreon. So a quick shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony DeBenedictis, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miglasio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howes. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. Okay, so we have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, Luoxana in heat and Mick Fleetwood in a fish costume make this episode dreadful. Picard trying to figure out how to make the Dixon Hill program relaxing while it keeps offering action movie hype was the only really funny part. 1 fish assassin out of 10. Yeah, that is pretty on point. Anyway, next comment is from Kyrie091, who says, this episode is the worst thing Mick Fleetwood ever did until 1995 when Fleetwood Mac released that awful album called Time. No Stevie Nicks, no thank you. Fleetwood Mac. As I mentioned, like everyone, not just, my Patreon comments, but everyone, all the reviews that I've read are really, really hung up on the fact that Mick Fleetwood is in this episode. And it is kind of a weird trivia thing because it's, he's playing a fish costume. You don't even recognize him. But yeah, I don't know. I am more interested in how terrible this episode is with Luoxana, but that's just me. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, in my humble opinion, this is easily the worst Luoxana and Troy episode in TNG and second worst appearance of her in general. Of course, number 1 being the Muse, #fuck the Muse. Anyway, this episode just sucks. She is constantly hitting on the younger men, including Picard, and it was not in the least bit funny. In fact, it was aggravating to me. And even though no one had interest in her, she would still be chasing and flirting with them. This is one of the most painful episodes in Trek to sit through. To me, this is top 5 worst of TNG. My rating is a 1 out of 10. And as per usual, Ricky and I are on the same page. I completely agree. Yes, Hashtag fuck the Muse, absolutely. But yeah, I agree that this is the second worst Loxana Troy, and the worst is the Muse. And it's pretty terrible that this isn't the worst Loxana Troy, because this is a really terrible episode in its own right. Anyway, we'll get to the final comment, which is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, "Look who forced herself back on the Enterprise. She's oversexed, overbearing, and overacting. Yep, it's everyone's favorite nymphomaniac telepath, Loxana Troy. This episode feels too similar to Lonely Among Us, with the same TOS vibe. Picard wants to escape her advances, who wouldn't? So he retreats into his Dixon Hill holodeck program. Why? He should go horse riding or read a book. Don't the safety protocols work in the Dixon Hill holodeck? I'm wondering why Picard is always having to duck and shout freeze program. I just shout stop to my Alexa. I enjoy Mr. Holmes' visual comedy, and the scenes with Data and Loxana are gold. Nice to see her on the receiving end for a change. Why doesn't Loxana know what a holodeck is? Mick Fleetwood is an assassin in a fish costume, ho-hum. 2 Datas looking cool in a suit out of 10. Way to go, Carlos." So, not find the scenes with Data and Loxana gold. That's just me. It was just too sitcom-y, and I guess this is something I forgot to mention to really get into, how the scenes with the whole thing with Picard being really obtuse and thinking it was a huge dinner, which, you know, when Picard mentioned the dinner to Riker could have just, he acted confused, so Picard should have realized something was up. It was all a huge, sitcom-y trope, and so him getting Data to distract Loxana and Troy just felt like another sitcom-y trope, so I personally hated it. I think the whole thing was stupid, because it just makes me think, I even went back and looked through Maurice Hurley's background to see if he worked on sitcoms before, because it seemed like it, because he makes TNG really sitcom-y, particularly in season 2. But he didn't, apparently. He worked on Miami Vice, which I haven't seen that, so maybe that, but when I think of that, I think of 80s cheese, so, maybe he is used to doing bullshit like this, but yeah. Anyway, yeah, I've heard that complaint before, that Picard having to say freeze program, a computer freeze program, is too long. There should have been an easier command, just like stop, computer stop, or computer freeze, or something like that. Yeah, it seems like he could have been quicker. But, I mean, sure, the holodeck safeties are a thing, but still, I mean, you'd think that being shot would still not be a pleasant experience, even with the safeties on. Or maybe not. Maybe it does nothing. The one time we actually do see the safeties function as they should is in The Bride of Chaotica, when Janeway is hit by the Chaotica's death ray, and it does nothing to her, and she's like, your feeble weapons are useless against me, and that's just the holodeck safeties operating. So actually, according to that episode, Picard wouldn't feel any pain, so maybe he shouldn't be freaked out. But the holodeck seems real, and so a guy pulling a gun on him and threatening to kill him is just his instinctual reaction is to be like, stop it, which I get. I think that does make a bit of sense. But anywho, also mentioned Holmes' visual comedy. I forgot to bring that up as well. That was fine. It's the one scene where Picard brought this bottle to dinner, and Holmes just takes it and drinks the whole thing in front of him. That was kind of funny, but it doesn't make up for how terrible this episode is, in my humble opinion. So my rating for Manhunt out of 10 is a 1, the worst. You're not surprised. This is easily a 1, easily the worst rating I could possibly give it. This is a reuse of jokes that were kind of funny in Haven, but redoing them in a way that's less funny. Focusing entirely on the Waxana instead of making her a side character, but making her very creepy and annoying and not understanding consent and not taking no for an answer. And and then having Picard actually play into this instead of putting her in her place and hiding in a holodeck, which apparently the holodecks don't function very well, and not able to give him the kind of story he wants until they do for no reason. And then the crew decides to act like immature high schooler or middle schoolers and gossip all of a sudden, I guess. And Loxana announces wedding plans without even consulting the person she's planning to marry. And then all of a sudden just realizes out of nowhere that that person doesn't want to marry them. The whole script was a giant mess. Oh, yeah, and the fish assassins. Just casually mention their assassins out of nowhere. Don't bother to warn anyone about the explosives of these assassins occurring. Why would you do that? And this is one of the worst written scripts in the entire show. It's the whole script is a mess. It's just a collection of bullshit that it's a jumbled mess. Don't know what they were doing here. This is one of the worst episodes of the entire franchise. So that's it for my review of Manhunt. Thanks so much for watching. So now let me see what's coming up next on my channel. Oh, God, okay, good. I was going to say, I need a good episode to review after this, and I'm given one. Thank you. The Emissary will be my next review, the Kalar episode, not the Benjamin Sisko Prophets episode. That's just Emissary. That's much later. This is The Emissary with Kalar, and that will be the next video or episode that I review, which will be coming out on Saturday. And then Monday, another new review with Peak Performance, and it's a halfway decent episode. Looking forward to getting into that. But then, of course, I got to get right back into the worst of the worst, because then Wednesday will be my review of Shades of Grey, which is terrible as that episode is. I think it's worse to sit through, but it won't anger me as much as this episode did. And then Saturday, I will be back to rank all of the episodes of Season 2 from my least favorite to my favorite. A new tradition I'll be doing after I finish covering each season of TNG. And yeah, by the end of the week, next week, I shall be done with Season 2. Thank God. Anyway, that's what's coming up on my channel. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with that, as well as many more reviews on Star Trek and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.